You can start, Cliff.
Okay. Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research and learning center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. It is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity community. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted these weekly webinars. But without our revenue-generating programs, we depend upon you for donations. You can donate by going to our website, globaljusticecenter.org. You'll also be able to access there recordings of past webinars. Today, we're going to delve into a bit of oral history, understanding of China as understood by our guest, Fred Pincus. He will take us on a journey of the following the evolving relationship with the People's Republic of China and the US left. Up until 1979, we were enamored with Mao's socialism. But then when Deng Xiaoping began to move the country toward market socialism, ambivalence set in. What did friendship with revolutionary China mean then? Or what does it mean now that it has evolved even further down the path that Deng Xiaoping had set for the country in 1979? Well, to delve into this, we have Baltimore socialist Fred Pincus. As an activist in the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, Fred was an early visitor to China in 1972 and 74 during the Mao years, before most U.S.ians could get there legally. I first went in 76, also just before legal travel to China was opened up. Fred was a member of the editorial committee of New China magazine in the 70s, and also covered China for the Guardian newspaper, an independent, radical news weekly in the late 70s and early 80s. He has recently published a memoir of, let me show.
Confessions of a Radical Academic.
Yes, that's the title. I just wanted to show it. If I can find, I have the picture someplace here. Well, anyway, Confessions of a Radical Academic that covers not only his China activism, but a whole lot more too. He has many other personal stories to that he could tell. But today we're going to focus on China. And so let me turn the floor over to Fred and hear his story. And I will be chiming in along the way where our experiences intersect. So go ahead, Fred, take it away.
Thank you, Cliff. I'm not a China scholar. I'm a sociologist, but I suppose I know more about China than most Americans do. But what I want to deal with today is the question, how do we know what we know about China? So I'm not going to give you a lot of analysis, but just my personal experiences. So consider this like a piece of data that one person's experience that may overlap with some of you and not with other you. And I hope it leads to a good discussion afterwards. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I hope we'll have a good discussion. So as Cliff mentioned, my first trip was in 1972, and I consider 1972 to 1982, I call it my China years, because I got very involved in China things. My first trip was sponsored by the Guardian newspaper for sustainers, people who gave money to the Guardian. And we went for 3 weeks, and my mind was totally blown at the time. I saw a concrete alternative to capitalism in China at the time. I saw a people-oriented country. Remember, serve the people was the big slogan at that time. I thought a lot about what human nature was or wasn't. And in the United States, it seems that, individualism was just part of being human. But in China, they were trying to show something else. And at the time, it appeared that it was working. I also, there are several things that really struck me. The idea of productive labor at the time, that professionals and administrators were supposed to perform several hours a week of productive labor so they didn't get too elitist and would know what's really going on at the grassroots at their workplace. And I really fantasized about some of my academic colleagues doing productive labor, and it seemed like it would really do them very, very well. In higher education, China had a kind of a class-based affirmative action for admissions. And since I was doing writing about community colleges, that was impressive. I also remember the no tipping policy, that we were instructed not to tip people because they were paid enough for a livelihood at the time. And I thought, yeah, that's certainly different than in the United States. This was as the Cultural Revolution was winding down, and there was a lot of talk about criticizing the capitalist roaders. And Liu Shaoqi was at the time the heir apparent to Mao, but he was purged. And Deng Xiaoping had some importance also, but he was purged at the time too. I remember hearing a lot about Liu, but I don't remember hearing about Deng Xiaoping at the time. but I couldn't get it in my head that these folks were really capitalists, since they were really part of the revolution in China. So I decided after a while that maybe the capitalist voters meant pro-Soviet socialist types who really believed in centralized planning, but also were very bureaucratic. Later, of course, it turned out that they really were capitalist voters, but at the time I didn't realize that. So when I came back, I got very involved in China things. I think along with Cliff and some others, we founded the Baltimore chapter of the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. I did a lot of speaking around the city, since very few people had been to China. I was, as Cliff mentioned, on the New China Magazine editorial committee, and I even taught a couple of courses on China, or an undergraduate course taught twice. So in 1974, I made my second trip, sponsored by the Friendship Association, and it was people from East Coast chapters of the Friendship Association. We went to some of the same places and some different places, but it just reinforced my views of my first trip. As I look back, I realized that even then, I actually wasn't 100% apologist for China, because I had certain reservations that I saw. I knew I didn't speak the language, so I couldn't have informal discussions with people on the street. I thought a lot about the Potemkin village effect in the Soviet Union, and I was wondering if somehow we were shown certain places, but they were the better off places than others. I noted the uniform dress, particularly among men, kind of with the Mao suits and that kind of thing. And I also noticed that in our various visits to workplaces, that when you ask questions, you got very similar answers. And it kind of bothered me a little bit, because I wasn't sure what it meant, and what it meant for a diversity of viewpoints. However, one of our guides liked Western classical music. And I remember we talked with him and said, gee, can't you get in trouble for this? Because, you know, it's considered bourgeois, and I think was actually banned during the Cultural Revolution. And he said, oh, it's okay as long as you don't broadcast it, which I took to mean you could enjoy it in your own home. And he was very enthusiastic when we offered to send him some tapes of Western music. Remember, this was 1972, way before things were digitized.
Yeah, Fred, the similarity of the answers was something that struck me also when I went in 76, and again in 78 and even 79. It was like there was a catechism that was to be recited, sometimes regardless of what the question was. But it had all been rehearsed, and all of those that we met with, knew the script. It struck me as being a very bureaucratic response in many ways. There was an orthodoxy that was being upheld, to be sure, but the cadre that we met seemed to have a very bureaucratic demeanor about them. And when in 82, I went to Cuba for the first time, I was struck by the difference. There wasn't that formalism among Cubans, and people were much more lively and open and personable in their responses, and I thought, well, hey, this is socialism with a Latin beat, rather than the Mandarin beat that was pervasive in China.
I had the same experience when I went to Cuba, that there was just a real difference there. But one of the things in 74, there was a campaign to criticize Confucius that was the big thing there. And it was, he was seen as an elitist. And that was part of the criticism of elitism in the party. And so before I went, I wanted to write an article about this. And so at every place that we went, this is my second trip, I would ask the following question: could you give me a concrete example of how the anti-Confucius campaign affected your school or workplace or so forth? And if I pressed, they would eventually, after the catechism, as Cliff put, actually say something. And I put it together and wrote an article that was published in New China magazine sometime in 1975. One of the other things I found was that in spite of the kind of slogan, "Women hold up half the sky," that there were just some unbelievable stereotypes that I found. So we went to a hospital and somebody asked why there weren't more women surgeons. And the male doctor who was speaking said, well, that's because they can't stand for long periods of time, particularly when they have their periods. And I remember just being dumbfounded that that wouldn't even go in the United States at the time. So it was a real mixture. But my feeling was that the positives far outweighed the negatives, at the time. The one thing I really disagreed with is China's foreign policy. And at the time, this was in 72 and 4, they saw the Soviet Union as the main enemy of the people of the world. And actually in some of the hostilities in different countries, they backed the American-backed side often rather than the Soviet-backed side. And I remember thinking that this was just wrong-headed. And in New China magazine, in our editorial meeting, I said, why don't we have a debate in the pages of the magazine on China's foreign policy? That was voted down. And then in 1975, either at a regional or national meeting, several of us wrote up a short paper called "On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Within the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association." I believe Cliff was part of that. And we argued for a discussion of China's foreign policy within the association. So that was voted down. And I really felt I couldn't continue in my role as on the editorial committee. So I quit. And I also really didn't participate that much in the local friendship association after that. Fortunately, The Guardian was looking for a China writer, and I stepped into that role, which I did until 1982. And I followed the Beijing Review and Xinhua News Service and mainstream China scholars, and really found that after Mao died, that China was moving away from Maoist policies. And rather than thinking of, what was good about the Cultural Revolution and what might be bad and building on the good things, they were kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so I started writing about that. I published an article in 1979 in the Review of Radical Political Economics on some of the changes in higher education. And mainstream scholars understood this, but a lot of people who were supporters of China didn't. So that was a big deal. I really loved the period when I wrote for The Guardian. I felt like I was free to say what I thought, and that I had some modest influence in helping the left understand what was going on in China and so forth. I stopped in 1982 mainly because my son was born, and I wanted to be an involved father, and I had other interests, and so I quit, and Cliff took over my China beat for a number of years with The Guardian. So between 1972 and 2005, during that period, China wasn't a part of my life for the most part. I was horrified at the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989. It was clear that there wasn't much room for debate in China. I was concerned with the growing authoritarianism and also moved toward capitalism. So I read some articles, but it really wasn't a big deal. And then in 2005, I went back to China.
Fred,
time,
before we
go on.
Before we get into that, you mentioned the Tiananmen, and of course that was a decisive event in the history of China. Here's one of the Guardian articles that I published at the time, because it was just 33 years ago this month that students began an encampment in Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing. And it became sort of the focal point for not only students, but also increasingly workers and peasants who were dissatisfied with the ruling elite and wanted the reforms that had been promised to actually materialize and benefit them. As we know, those protests went on for about 2 months before finally the Chinese military were able to come in with tanks and crush that with great bloodshed. But that was really an important event, which when I went back in years later, nobody would talk about. It was as if it had never happened, although in their head they knew about it, but they would not talk about it. It was not part of the orthodox history that the party was putting out.
Thanks, Cliff. So in 2005, I went back to attend a conference in Beijing, and I went with my wife. I wasn't part of a group. We spent a week in Shanghai and a week in Beijing. We hired a guide from the China International Travel Service, which was the government travel bureau at the time. And my mind was blown again, even more so than on my first trip, but of course, for different reasons. The first activity that we had was a trip to a beautiful garden that honored Confucius. And I thought, wow, this is really something, since I had published an article criticizing Confucius and things had now turned around. In walking around, we saw a great deal of construction in the central area of Shanghai. And a lot of the old housing was torn down and new high-rise apartments and office buildings were being erected. And I remember I asked our guide, whose name, by the way, was Daniel. At that time, a lot of the Chinese that dealt with foreigners kind of, I guess, created a name for themselves. Anyhow, Daniel said they were moved to housing in the suburbs. So this is something that I guess in our country we call urban removal. It seemed to be a similar process that was going on there. There was a lot of talk in the English language Chinese press about growing inequality, economic inequality. And I talked with Daniel about it. And specifically, I said, are the rich people capitalists? And he said, no, we don't have capitalists in China. You know, it's socialist. And I said, well, a lot of these folks own large businesses that employ other people and they're profit making. And certainly in the West, we call these people capitalists. And he said, no, we don't have a capitalist class in China. Daniel, by the way, was also a party member who told me how he was he bought a couple of apartments, one of which his parents would live in, one of which he was speculating on, essentially. So after other discussions, Daniel understood where I was coming from. And he says, you know, you should go visit this museum called the Propaganda Poster and Art Center. And I said, okay, are you going to come with us? And he said, oh, no. But he, you know, he wrote out the address and gave it to the taxi driver. And we went over, and it was 5 high-rise apartment buildings. And the guard there, you know, told us where to go. And we wended our way around and went down some stairs on building number 5. And it was kind of, I felt like I was going to a laundry room or something. And we came to a door with Chinese characters on it. And we opened the door, and there was the Cultural Revolution. There were posters and copies of little red books and banners and all kinds of things. And it was 2 small rooms. And I, you know, I thought to myself, gosh, the Cultural Revolution that I saw everywhere in '74 was in 2 small rooms at the bottom of the high rise. That still exists, although I just read that they moved to different quarters. So I presume it's a little bigger now.
I wonder if it's still possible to find this book in China. The little red book of quotations of Chairman Mao. It was at the time the number one bestseller of any book in the world, even outsold the Bible.
Yes, and at the museum they had it, and I bought a copy. I can't remember. It might have been $10 or $15 when it originally sold for pennies.
Yeah, yeah, they were giving it away.
Yeah.
Um, on
Oh,
the matter of capitalist rotors, or capitalists rather, um, since then, China has gone on to admit avowed capitalists as members of the party, even.
Yes.
So they've come a long ways since then.
Yes, they have. The issue of tipping came up again. And on this 2005 trip, we were told we didn't have to tip, but if people gave really outstanding service, we can give them a small tip. So Natalie and I took a train trip to Suzhou, which was about an hour outside of Shanghai. And we spent the day there, and we again hired a guide. And she was pretty good. And on our way to the train station, I gave her $10 as a tip. And she looked at me horrified and said, "It's not enough." And I thought, whoa, this is not according to Western norms here. And I said something like, well, we were just told the small tip would be okay. And I had told her to split it with the driver. And she said, this isn't even enough for the driver. And I said, yeah, things have changed. So then we flew to Beijing to this conference. And the conference was put on by an organization called Diversity in Organizations. They're still around. They have an annual conference. I had submitted a paper. They accepted it. And I figured, and Beijing happened to be the country it was in that year. So my paper was called Marxist Theories of Education. When I got the program, I looked through it and I found that out of the, I don't know, 50 or 75 papers, however many were, mine was the only one with Marxism in it, in the title. And I thought I was a little surprised about that because a lot of Chinese were giving papers. So I gave my paper. There were a few questions. And as I was leaving, a man came up to me, thanked me for my paper, and asked if he could get a copy. And I said, sure. And he gave me his card. And I said I'd email it to him. And in the course of discussion, it turned out he was a faculty member at one of the institutes of higher education in Beijing, and was also a Communist Party member. And he thanked me for teaching him about Marxism. And I was really stunned. And I said, but you're a party member. You must have had a lot of Marxism. And he said, yes, but that wasn't the real Marxism. You've taught me about the real Marxism. And I was so stunned thinking, what is the world coming to, or China coming to, when this party member college professor has to rely on a bourgeois foreigner to teach him Marxism.
That reminds me of an experience in Cuba when a good Cuban friend of mine, Miguel Limia, was asked by members of the Chinese embassy in Havana to give them lessons on Marxism.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I came home, I had a lot of what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. trying to really figure out what I saw, what I thought I saw, what I didn't see. So I decided to spend a couple of months reading about China, particularly reading about the Cultural Revolution and higher education, which is what I knew most about. And I decided to concentrate on progressive China scholars. There's people who thought really well of China during Cultural Revolution days, but writing in 2005 about what they saw then. And I thought that was kind of similar to my own experience. I decided not to read a lot of the memoirs that were being published that were very critical of the Cultural Revolution, because most of them were from kind of the more privileged people at the time. And I knew they had a really bad time during the Cultural Revolution, but I wasn't sure about everybody else. So I did some reading, and two of the people were Mo Bo Gao and Suzanne Pepper. And I found that, in retrospect, they were saying that there was significant progress during that period in education and in economic development. But there were also real problems, which I certainly didn't appreciate at the time. I guess my working conclusion after a while was that things weren't as rosy as I had thought, but they weren't as bad as people say it was. And what I had found over the years is that in China, when there's a really change in perspective, there's a process of monstrifying what happened before. So in the early 70s, the period before the Cultural Revolution was terrible. Everything was terrible about it, and everything was wonderful in the 70s. And then, of course, in the post-Mao period, everything was horrible about the Cultural Revolution, and everything was great then. So again, I'm certainly not totally sure what the reality was, but that was my best sense. Then I went back to putting my head in the sand again about China until actually the Trump administration. And when Trump started slapping tariffs on Chinese exports and the like, my knee-jerk reaction was to protect China and to think, oh, there's a new Cold War that's starting and so forth. And then, of course, Biden continued some of this in a slightly different way. I did appreciate China's ascension as a superpower and a real material opponent of the United States, which was still a superpower, but receding somewhat. So I understood that was going on. And then there was the crackdown on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And of course, the things you read in the press, there were talks of genocide and authoritarianism and really so forth. And I really wasn't sure what was going on. So I decided to educate myself a little bit and listen to some webinars that were being given about the Uyghurs. And the first one that I saw was put on by a group called Pivot for Peace. And there were three speakers. two on the Uyghurs and one on Hong Kong. So this was maybe a year ago. And the first speaker was basically saying there was nothing that was really wrong with the Uyghurs, that there were some separatist terrorists that were dealt with harshly, but that was about all. And then there was a talk by a man named Ken Hammond, who was, I think, a Asia historian. And he gave a talk on China's policy toward minorities. And as he was speaking, I went back 50 years and realized I heard the same talk in 1974 when we visited the Central Institute of Minorities. And it was, you know, how China respected all cultures, and in minority areas, there was often semi-autonomy and respect for culture and language, but at the same time as wanting to bring them in the mainstream. And I was increasingly furious with the fact that the point wasn't the official policy. The point was how it was manifested on the ground. And he didn't say a thing. And I felt this anger because I know what apologism is all about. I was there. So I listened to a couple of other webinars that were more informative and more balanced. And, you know, some people were saying that it's kind of a forced assimilation, and genocide is a little harsh and stuff like that. And then my Jewish group wanted to bring a Uyghur speaker to speak to the group. And I remember the woman who mentioned it said, you know, there was genocide against the Jews, genocide against the Uyghurs. And there was a particular speaker that she had heard at her synagogue that she thought was good. The name was Rushan Abbas. And I did a little research on her and found that she was a government translator at Guantanamo for the Uyghurs that were there, that one of the organizations she was involved with has gotten big money from the National Endowment for Democracy, which wreaked havoc in Central America. And also, she talked about Shenzhen as East Turkestan. So she clearly was on the side of what the Chinese called separatists. And I figured, well, hearing her, we're not going to learn very much. And her sister was one of the Uyghurs that had disappeared for a while. So she talked about that experience. So we didn't bring her. And then the events in Hong Kong started developing even before the Chinese institute, I can't remember what it's called, but whatever law they have now. And I'm thinking, well, were the so-called pro-democracy forces really pro-democracy, or were there agents of Western imperialism, or, you know, exactly what's going on? It certainly seemed to me that there's crushing dissent in Hong Kong, but again, to get a handle on that is complicated. My TalkFest group, that's just an informal group in Baltimore. We meet once a month to discuss various issues. And we discussed China a couple of times. I was able to do some more reading on what the structure of China's economy is at present, so forth. And then, of course, at present, when China is certainly not criticizing Russia and seeming to possibly support that, it's hard for me to get my head around that. So I talk about some of these things in my memoir. I can hold this. Whoops, can't see very well. That doesn't come out. Okay. And I know I asked Cliff to make some comments just because his experiences overlap with mine in some cases and are different in other cases. So I guess I come back to the question, how do we know what we know about China? And I'll leave it at that. Cliff, you want to make some more comments? Or?
Well, yeah, let me say a word on that question. How do we know about China? China has always been enigmatic. Certainly before it was easy or even possible for Westerners to have access to the country. You know, China experts would hole up in Hong Kong and try to read the tea leaves of information that they got from the mainland. But one of the sources of information that that I know you and I both and many others found very useful was Bill Hinton. Bill Hinton was a Pennsylvania farmer who was in China at the time of the revolution as part of a UN agricultural mission. And when that was withdrawn, he stayed on and proceeded to observe firsthand the unfolding of the revolution, particularly in the village of Longbo in Shanxi province. It was, and out of that came, this book, Fan Shen, a documentary of revolution in a Chinese village. It was one of the most influential books that I've ever read because it gave you a concrete view of a revolutionary process in this village. Now, that's the kind of information, of course, that until Fan Shen was published, was generally not available in the West. And the US government did its best to try to keep it from being published. When Hinton returned to the US some years later, his notes were confiscated by customs. And it was several years with legal battles and so on before he was able to get his notes released so that he could use them to write this book. So, I mean, that's his story. I always think of as a telling example of how our government has tried its utmost to prevent us from learning about China, particularly about revolutionary processes. And of course, Hinton went on to publish many other books on China. He was there at the time of the Tiananmen massacre and has written an account of that event, and as well as political assessments of the changes, the turning point, as he calls it, that China went through. And, so I would highly recommend William Hinton's books on China. How about you, Fred? What are some of the
Oh,
other?
absolutely. I remember reading Fan Shen, and then the subsequent second book on Longbow. I can't remember.
Shen Fan.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
Fan Shen means to turn over, and Shen Fan means to turn over again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember in the late 60s and early 70s, some of you may remember too, that a lot of people on the left were reading that. And it was very informative. It was important in my thinking too.
On this question of our thinking, our encounter with China was with Maoism, and for my part, I know I was a follower of Mao's thought. Great admirer of what was being done in China, like you, and also on the theoretical level, embracing a lot of Mao's ideas. Now, of course, that's what has since come into great disfavor in China. And, much of it we need to rethink now. Where are you in that process?
I had a feeling you were going to ask me that. I agree with you. I haven't delved into that. I still have my volumes of the works of Mao Zedong and stuff, but I guess my head isn't in a place to jump into that. Certainly. Well, I guess I never waved the little red book around, but again, I think one has to look at the theory and then see how it was manifested in practice.
Mm-hmm.
I think in China, they have a little difficulty in trying to figure out how to deal with Mao. And my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that he's seen as a great revolutionary, important, in the build up for liberation, possibly the first, few years afterwards. And then he made, I guess, what's called errors. And I don't know. I know when I was in 2005, I bought a book that was put out by one of the English language Chinese press. And it's a biography of Mao, a short one. And as I recall, most of it deals with pre-1949. And not too much afterwards. And it's ticklish in China because if Mao made mistakes, that means the party made mistakes. And that's not something that party members like to really think about much. So I don't know how much that's discussed. It would be interesting to know in kind of party political education circles how it's really handled. I don't really know, but Mao is such a giant figure in China that it would be hard to wipe him out like they might do with others. So I'm hedging.
Yeah. Well, we all are. One of the assessments of the Cultural Revolution in particular that I find useful was Bill Hinton's, who said that Mao raised all the right questions, but didn't have the answers.
Yeah.
So on the conceptual level, I mean, Mao saw that socialist construction required not only changing property relations, but also changing human beings, changing the culture, changing people's mentality. And that's what the Cultural Revolution was seeking to do. It raised the question of the need for that change in human beings, but didn't figure out how to do it successfully.
Yeah. There was a question I saw from the chat about China-Taiwan relations. And I think one of the constants with all of the political turmoil that's taken place since 1949 is the Chinese belief that Taiwan is part of China. And I think that that's what's thought now. And I remember when I was there, that's what they said. And that really seems to be a constant.
Can I share a concern?
Yeah, I haven't been monitoring the chat. So
That's all right. I haven't actually. I have a concern, but a little background is that from 1958 to 1962, I was in the Navy, and I was an electronics specialist, also an atomic bomb loader on our planes on the carrier, on the Ranger. And I was extended from January to June because of my talents. And it was to have a period of 4 days where China was going to be taking back Taiwan, Formosa. And we had our planes in the air for 4 days, round the clock, with atomic bombs loaded, and China backed off. And my concern is that China is now studying the effects of what's happening in Ukraine. And they have not forgotten over the last 50 years or so that they really would like to have Taiwan back in their hold, especially because of the chip production. But I have the feeling that they are going to be a presence militarily in the near future, based on what happens with us and our support in the Ukraine. So what is your take on China going into the next 1 to 5 years?
This sort of is borders going outside my field of expertise, but I think I certainly hope that they don't try to take back Taiwan, because that would really be a problem, even though I could concede it's part of China. And I don't know, the Ukraine is such a complicated situation with clear Russian aggression, but NATO aggression in the preceding years. So it's a complicated situation, but that is scary, noting that there were planes loaded with atomic bombs for 4 days. What year was that? Yeah, you're muted. You're muted.
Excuse me, it was January to June. It was actually January when they backed off of 1962.
62. Okay, thanks.
I should mention, for those who are watching this on YouTube, if you have a question or want to make a comment, you need to send an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will pass your message on to those in the Zoom room. And those of you who are in the Zoom room, of course, you can present your questions more directly. And I see you by raising your hand or just waving at me. I see Norma Harrison has her hand up, so let me call on Norma. Unmute yourself.
Hi.
Hiya.
I have a lot to say. I put a lot of it into the chat that seems to be a different chat from the chat that you have. And I thought maybe I'd ask if there's a place to send. Maybe I'll just email Cliff and he can have it for posterity, what I've written. The thing that I've been very vocal, as it were, about the Russia-Ukraine issue. My comments to whoever will read them are that the whole thing is a result, well, is in line with that 100+ years of attack have gone on against the Soviet Union because of the fear by our owners of the entry of communism into the slaves discussion. And of course, the idea of communism, socialism has spread quite far, actually, through at least half the world, if not more. And so our owners have every right to be frightened about the Bolshevik Revolution, which is what the 100+ years is all about. Russia has been slapped back most insultingly from the time that it's gained its liberatory behaviors, as I say, in 1917 on. And the insult is incredible. Pulling back from what is apparently the idea of us being able to serve us, to give us good lives, knowing and learning what a bad life we lead, what an enslaved life we lead here on our owner's plantation. This whole process is being smacked down by US hegemony horrors committed against the people on Earth and against Earth itself. As you know, Earth, whether or not it survives in any form with which we're familiar, is more and more under question every day. So the things I've put together, well, that was one big point. Also, I'd like you to know that about 20 years ago, a client told me, got me books from the library about Tibet. One of them is by Anna Louise Strong. I'm sure you're familiar with her. And another is by Stuart and Roma Gelder, both of them having visited, I think, in 1953, and then writing about their experience. And one of the things, of course, they describe is how bad and terrible the people were treated or were being treated there, and the process of the revolutionary rise that occurred by the Red Army along its long march, having camped outside of Tibet and Lhasa, having camped outside of Lhasa for several years, to the encouragement of the peasants' uprising, that they were able to walk in to Lhasa with doing very little, if any, damage, and help the peasants take over their lives from the brutality of the system that they had been living in, which I thought very exciting. It had, I mean, I knew I felt that way, but then here was this backup of obvious information. So these are the things that go on with this kind of effort that the people make behind the idea that we are in an enslaved relationship here on our owner's plantation. We don't, I've described it as a despotic, totalitarian autocracy. And I took all those words very meaningfully, because we are that controlled, and our minds are controlled. Our children go to school and learn to say the pledge every day that they come into school, pledge to the flag and to loyalty and to march in line and to sit at the desks and to follow the rules that will eventually lead them maybe to a successful experience in life, getting a job that works for them and so forth, to fit in to this horrible relationship that is created, that serves our owners, not very far distant from the monarchies that we struggle to relieve ourselves from.
Norma, you raised Tibet, and I wonder if Fred wants to say something about the issue of Tibet, as because some of the same charges that are we now hear made about treatment of the Uyghurs also have been made with reference to Tibet.
Yeah, the one thing I want to say is I wish my friend Tom Grunfeld was on. He's a China scholar that specializes in Tibet. And I know that in New China magazine back in the 70s, he wrote an article about Tibet that was not all that dissimilar from what you're describing. And I remember in a brief discussion I had, he simply said, well, that was then and things change. So I'm not quite sure what that means, but it is similar about what the official policy says and what happens on the ground, and they're not necessarily the same thing. But
these are people who went there, right? They went there and stayed and examined the place and so forth.
Oh, I know, but that was what, 50, 60 years ago?
Yeah, that is very indicative of.
And what may have happened, what happened then is not the same with what may be happening now. So I'm again just raising a question mark. I don't know what the answer is.
But as you pointed out, Fred, though the reality on the ground may be different, the official line has remained the same.
Yeah.
Same policies toward minority regions now as was the case, 70 years ago.
Communism is a difficult thing for people to understand. We have had millennia of indoctrination to service, to enslavement, to masters. And the structure is built into our thinking. So the idea of having to repeat ideas over and over again, to have the catechism, to be able to come out of it, is not obnoxious to me.
Are there others who would like to speak?
You see
Oh,
Kathleen has,
Okay, I see Kathleen O'Connell. And
Hi. 10 years ago, I spent 5 months in China on second class buses and trains and doing a lot of walking. And I spoke Mandarin, so I just talked to people myself. Now, life post-communism, and I would say it is post-communist in China at this point, is hard for people. Everyone is hopeful of having a bit more stuff, and everybody wants to have a better place to live, a bit more money. But after my camera was snatched in Guilin, Chinese people started confiding in me about the petty crime that they have to put up with all the time. And I believe under communism, there was very little crime. They really had a lid on it. But their gangs have come up. I don't know how to say this briefly without telling you a lot of people's stories, but there isn't really much rule of law. There's a lot of laws in China, but mostly it's the rule of strong men. It's whose faction you're a part of, who you can appeal to for support. And in a way, so many patterns in China that were historical have replicated themselves. So when I was leaving, I went from Guangzhou to Hong Kong. And there was a thing happening in Guangzhou that was very typical of the time, which is that local Communist Party members would use their position to dispossess peasants of their land and sell the land to speculators. There was a lot of building going on in China at the time. And in this case, the mayor of the village actually stood up for the peasants. And he lodged protests at successively higher administrative levels. And the local Communist Party people who were speculating had him killed. And the peasants protested. They actually, I mean, it's photographs that are almost timeless in the context of China, but they went to the district headquarters and all the peasants are like practically prostrate on the floor, and they just stayed there protesting this death. And in the Guangzhou paper, it said after a while they realized that they were wrong, that all the witnesses who had seen this guy get run down by a truck, which was a common method of assassination, they had made a mistake, and they were attention seekers who were hysterical and just trying to make a name for themselves. And Hong Kong at the time still had freedom of the press, so there was a different story in Hong Kong. There were still in China at this time, there was some opening, and there were human rights lawyers who actually existed, and there were a couple who got involved. And they they petitioned the highest levels of the Communist Party in Beijing, just the way it used to happen with the emperor and the mandarins. I wanted to be clear that my comments about what I experienced are not a comment on communism. They're a comment on what's going on in China right now, which, as far as I can tell, has very little to do with communism and a great deal to do with nationalism and domination by an elite. It's as I was saying, it's very hard for people in China. At the time, they were investing heavily in the Eastern Seaboard and in industrialization, and not in villages at all. You'd go to villages and walk around, And they would have electrification to the point that there'd be like one light bulb and maybe an old TV in a house. And one great triumph of the revolution, as far as I could see, is that they have primitive sanitation, but they have sanitation everywhere. There are public toilets. Maybe they're dirty, maybe you don't like them, but as opposed to India that gained independence at the same time, all over China, there is control of sewage. That, public health is one of the most important things that a government can do. And I spent 5 months eating street food and traveling, as I said, second or third class, and I never got sick, which is not like India at all. So the communist government, in my view, as far as I can tell, did some very important things for public health, and they still have widespread. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. I spent 5 months there, and I've been thinking about it ever since and trying to understand what's what. But I'll stop rambling and just say that it's very hard to know what's going on if you're using secondhand sources. And at the time I was there was this whole opportunistic American thing. Let's go make money in China. And their rationalization was, we'll bring democracy to China through capitalism, because everybody wanted to rush in and make a lot of money, which they did. And so there were all these pundits writing about how bringing capitalism to China was going to make it a democracy. Well, just wish people would do what I did. And I realized that it was an investment of years to study the language, and which I speak very, very badly because it's a very challenging language, and an investment of 5 months of traveling at a level of, normal people, not what, but I wish that pundits would go do this before they write books about the place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Kathleen. I spent 2.5 months in China on a work-study trip. We lived for a month with a peasant family at Red Star People's Commune, just outside Beijing. Spent a couple weeks, working in a textile factory. So I've got some experience with, with ordinary people. It was not a Potemkin village kind of tour, but not knowing any Chinese, of course, the ability to communicate with Chinese was very limited. But you talk about the improvements, public versus private. One of the things that I observed was that this was in 1979, that the village that I was in had good public facilities. The streets were clean and all of that. But then when I went back in the early 90s and revisited that same village, the streets were no longer clean, but the houses now were much nicer. They had central heating and all of the rest. So greater emphasis was being placed on the private rather than the public. So, unfortunately, I have not been able to be there more often, more frequently, and even greater disadvantage, never had Chinese. But Fred, do you want to?
If I could just say another thing, which is that at the time that I was there, which was right after the Olympics, everybody in China wanted, there was this huge thing, let's all get rich. And you would be walking around in a city in a very poor area, because lots of cities still, their individual homes wouldn't have plumbing, but there would be a public restroom that everybody in the neighborhood would use. You'd be in a place like that, and then you'd run into a Prada store and a Gucci store, and there was all this conspicuous consumption going on. And I have to say that I was really struck knowing the profound sacrifices that a generation of revolutionaries made to create revolutionary China, to see where it had ended up at this conspicuous Prada Gucci consumption thing with masses of people in front of these stores taking selfies in front of them. And in my view, when a revolution is carried forth by an elite, it's very likely that at some point, serving the revolution begins to erode in favor of keeping the people in power. And I believe that's part of what happened.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I mean, you had a.
Can I say something in line with what she just said?
Oh, let
Yeah,
Fred
after
speak,
I do.
please.
That you had a really, unique or unusual experience, and I didn't have any of that. So I wish that I did, but I didn't. I was kind of on tours. But what you said about the Gucci stores reminded me that was sort of one of the huge changes that I saw between 72, 74, and then 2005, the influence of Western stores and commerce and stuff like that. And I remember when I first went to the Great Wall in November of 72, we climbed up the wall and up one of the sides. And I remember saying, I kind of expected a Coke machine at the top. But what there only was is a sign that said, don't go any further, because that was the unconstructed part. Well, in 2005, I went back to the Great Wall, and while there weren't Coke machines at the top, there were Coke machines at the bottom. And there were all kinds of merchants and that sort of thing. And I understand that tourism is a very important source of revenue in China. And they've really tried to develop the tourist trade. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And when I was there in the early 70s, it was, I think most of the groups that went at the time were friendship groups or political groups or something like that, and where the prices were fairly reasonable of going there. But gradually, it's gotten more expensive as they develop the tourist trade, and I don't see anything wrong with that. The only other thing I'll say, and now I'll go back to Norma, is my sense is that capitalism and the socialisms that we've seen in action have good and bad points. And I've often thought that in China, in recent years, they sort of have the negatives of capitalism and the negatives of socialism in terms of the bureaucratic issues that people have raised. Norma, you wanted to say something? You're muted.
Yeah, I know. Thanks. I forgot the line I was going to follow that Kathleen was talking about. I really enjoyed what Kathleen had to say. Kathleen. I am, however, going to look at something I've written in the chat. And that is that China is still socialist. You know, the rich do not run China. They do not control the government, and they're distant from the operations there. The thing we're looking at is that China has had to be guided by the furious worldwide engendered by the US hegemony opposition. It has not inhibited China's and other nations' socialist, communist going. That the silly left demands doing it according to the rules they've derived from their reading and parlor salons blinds those analyses. I repeat the information to us all that coming out of millennia of indoctrination into following our leaders and trying to find the way for us to follow us, for us to give us direction, for us to enable, I mean, water to 1.2 billion people, is it? How many people are in China that they've supplied water indoor? And I'm told that there's indoor water at least for 8 million, 800 million. So doing that kind of a thing, we have no idea about lifting that kind of effort. And people had to teach themselves, this is an essential and so forth. So they've been doing that and not understanding that this comes from, I mean, you can't call it a communist perspective. You have to call it a humane perspective. And you have to go with the humaneness of trying to do the things which absolutely are anti-done in the capitalist countries. So maybe you'll get a chance to read what I've written and it might help you think. There is a fellow named K.J. Noh, N-O-H. I've put his name into the chat that I'm using off of this structure, this system, who writes brilliantly, who has brilliant experience. I think he's Chinese, maybe it's Japanese, but anyway, that's terrible. I find his work extremely elucidative, and you might too. You just put his name in, you'll get lots of information about what he's said.
You know, I will say also that I have never been in a place where information was so comprehensively controlled. So the
You
internet,
haven't been to the United States. Okay.
you know, I just through chance after China, I was in Egypt during the revolution, and I have to say, in Mubarak's Egypt, there was more freedom of speech and press than in China. So in China, the internet is controlled. And at the time, if you were a relatively wealthy Chinese, you could get a proxy server through Hong Kong and get a non-controlled internet access. That now, because of what's going on in Hong Kong, that line out of censorship has been closed. But you could get, if you went to places where there were tourists, which generally I didn't go to, but you could get a few foreign periodicals, and they would literally have the 3 T's excised. So if they mentioned Tibet, Taiwan, or Tiananmen, they would take a little razor and they'd actually excise the offending term. And they were already very pro-Confucius by the time I was there. In long-distance buses in China, they show movies. So I saw a lot of nationalistic movies where sometimes Confucius also did martial arts to make it more thrilling. Very pro-Confucian, very nationalistic, beating up Japanese people, beating up Americans, very anti-colonialist. He has really taken down recently some of the biggest capitalists because I think he wants no other PowerPoints. He's been consolidating power for a long time. The highest levels of the Communist Party are very corrupt, and they've made a lot of money off of the situation. When he wants to take somebody down, he calls them on the corruption, and that's that with that. And at the time that I was there, they had decided, and I think this is true, that the high level of corruption at local Communist Party levels was a drag on the economy, and they were using journalists to attack this, but only up to a certain level. So it's not my perception that the leaders are purely disinterestedly following the good of the people at this point. But that said, I am very distressed by the United States policy toward China, which strikes me as just about the most primitive, unhelpful, to only see the world as we're the biggest gorilla in the sandbox and we've got to beat up that other gorilla if they get in our sandbox. Nothing good is going to come out of this American guerrilla foreign policy toward China. Even though I condemn completely Xi's totalitarian regime, I condemned wholeheartedly American guerrilla in the sandbox foreign policy toward China. It's a terrible lack of imagination and more vicious hegemony, so whatever.
Before we end, I'd like to bring up one other point that, Fred and I were both active in the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association in Baltimore. And one of the things that I found interesting was that, we were under FBI surveillance. Now, this was after Nixon had been to China, relations had been established, presumably the countries were friendly with one another, and yet the FBI was still checking out those of us who had been advocates of friendship between the US and China. For example, I got my FBI records through FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request. And as I looked at them, I found that that our local friendship association had been infiltrated. There was an FBI informant there. So, they were keeping their eye on us as they were on Fred. And I think you have a story to tell about that, Fred.
Yeah, I was also on the FBI list, and I was in a category where I was supposed to be investigated twice a year. And what happened was I was on sabbatical, and I moved from Baltimore to New York temporarily to take up residence with my now wife. And there were these semi-panicked messages in my file that they didn't know where I was. And it's kind of like I must have gone underground or something. And over a period of weeks, I guess, they located me. My name, of course, was on the building register that anybody could see. But the interesting thing is that they didn't seem to be concerned that I was active in the Friendship Association. And in fact, I was removed from the list I was on of dangerous people. So I don't know, they probably kept an eye on things, but apparently friendship work didn't seem to be that horrible to them. And this is the first I heard that there was some infiltration in our local group.
That's our one consolation is the incompetence of the FBI, because my uncle was in the very first foreign exchange with the Soviet Union of academics in 1960. So he had to be vetted by the FBI up, down, and all around. Very, very lengthy process. Finally, he went off to Moscow, and on Christmas, my grandparents sent him some money, a money order for his Christmas present. 2 days later, the FBI was knocking at their door in the countryside. You sent money to the Soviet Union.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
So we've reached the end of our time. Is there any last comment or question that anyone needs to make before we sign off?
Thank you for letting me go on, and I'm sorry my thoughts weren't better organized. I'm still trying to understand everything, and I really appreciate your presentation. It's in many ways, it strikes me as a huge unbearable tragedy. And yeah.
Well,
Well,
thank you, Fred. Thank you, Fred
Kathleen,
and
I'm
Cliff
glad
and
that you were able to join us and share some of your
Norma.
experiences.
Kathleen. Thanks for your input.
Yeah.
I'm
And
gonna, if you hang out, I'm gonna put up a connection to a meeting, to a presentation with Vijay Prashad on our public radio station, which illuminates thinking. He is talking about the Ukraine-Russia thing. I have to look it up, or you could send me a note. If you're interested, I'll put my name in the email. I'll put my address, norma@pacbell.net.
okay.
Do you get the chat? Does everybody get the same chat? Because I
course.
have. Oh, okay.
Of course. Okay, well, we will be having a webinar in a few weeks about Ukraine. And so we'll have fuller discussion of that then. But right now, I want to thank Fred for his presentation, for sharing his experience over
Yes.
those years. And hopefully we will, among the followers of the Center for Global Justice, there are a number of people who've had activism that is intersected with historical events. And so maybe we can have future webinars on of an oral history character such as this was.
Thanks, Cliff. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you, Fred.
Yeah.
And today's webinars, as well as past programs, are available on our YouTube, on our website at www.globaljusticecenter.org. Next week, we will have Carl Davidson speaking on revitalizing manufacturing with the Green New Deal. And so I hope you'll join us for that. But finally, let me give thanks to our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.